right, welcome to our experience, the ASCP podcast. My name's Chad Wers. I'm the chief executive, alongside my virtual partner, Tom, who is in his house somewhere in North Carolina.
North Kakalaki.
There you go. I feel like we should do a song to start this one, like dun 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 dun. Dun. I mean, this is the election coverage podcast, and we have two of our one former and one current policy directors from ASCP. Jim Lewis is our current, Veronica Charles is our former, and they are everything that has been ASCP's policy and political direction, at least in the last 6 years since I've been here. So, welcome.
Thanks, yeah.
Veronica, why don't we start, just tell us a little bit about what you're doing now.
Yeah, so since leaving ASCP, I've taken over as the Senior Director of Government Affairs at Maxim Healthcare Services, which is a large provider of home health, home care nationwide. We're in 37 states, and we specialize in providing care for kiddos with disabilities. So I oversee our West Coast region and Ohio and New York, just because there's some problem states. I also oversee our federal government affairs practice, and I oversee a team of government affairs directors and managers that work through policy on a state Medicaid level every day and really work through some of the same stuff that we're used to. So Medicare reimbursement, Medicaid reimbursement, scope of practice issues, and anything that really falls within that portfolio. So we stay busy throughout, even outside of August when states are in session and Congress isn't. We can always kind of jump back and forth and talk about what's happening at the state level, what's happening at the federal level, which is a really great perspective to have.
And how many state capitals have you not seen?
So that's actually a fun question. I can answer it both ways. Adam, my fiance, and I have been to 25.
That's awesome.
So 25 and 25 if you classify the District of Columbia as a state.
Which we don't.
So therefore, I still have 26 left.
There you go. All right, pretty awesome. All right, Jim, tell everybody, and everybody, you don't need an introduction, but tell everybody what you do.
So yeah, for Jim Lewis, I'm ASCP's Director of Government Affairs and Policy and Advocacy. That's actually not even the Department's Policy and Advocacy. And so basically I'm the voice for ASCP on Capitol Hill to regulatory agencies, as well as supporting our state chapters when things pop up in the states. So been on the team here about 3.5 years. So everything from, our official comment letters to CMS, to us reaching out to CMS when there's a problem, to, whether it's, things like long-term care pharmacy definition and provider status on the Hill, or, how do we position pharmacists to be, well positioned in something like the 21st Century Cures Act or Cures 2.0. Sort of that's my full scope of responsibilities.
I don't have a trick question for you about state capitals. You've been to a convention before.
I've been to two, Charlotte and Philly.
There you go.
So yeah, traditionally I volunteer in the sort of satellite booking studio. But dust off my old comms PR skills and book mostly high-end surrogates. But then one of my favorites is actually to book the person who's from Roanoke, Virginia, on their local NBC station.
Yeah.
So they can tell everybody back home how cool and exciting it is. And these people have never been on TV. They've never been to one of these conventions. They're super excited, and their families all lose their minds, and it's super fun. And so I did that in Charlotte and in Philly. And then of course it was COVID for the 2020, and then it just didn't quite work out to go to Chicago this time around.
All right, so this is, election's serious business, which is why I've got my tie and suit on today. Naturally, Tom, I guess, has not taken it
a little more cash.
Seriously.
It's more casual now.
But on a sort of a serious pivot note, this is an election year. It's crazy. People call it silly season. I think it lives up to its name, particularly this year. But from a ASCP pharmacist and pharmacy and member perspective, how can we look at this election season from a, not from a political perspective necessarily, but from a what's good for us perspective? How should we be looking at this as pharmacists across the country and members of ASCP? feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to take the first pass.
Yeah, I was like, go for it. I was like, I'm
Jim's the voice, so if Jim disagrees with me, he can take ASCP in whatever direction
That's
he
right.
wants. I really see that this is going to break down really 4 different ways. So one, you have Donald Trump wins the election, and the GOP takes Congress. So they would have to win in both the Senate and the House. So now you have a Republican majority trifecta. Same thing. Kamala Harris wins the presidency, and then the Democratic Party takes over as a trifecta. And then the other 2 scenarios are a little bit less fun, but it's really what we've been living through for the past, 12 years or so, which would be either Donald Trump takes the presidency or Kamala Harris, and they split Congress. So whether that be through one chamber, so either the House or the Senate, vice versa, regardless, they have a different party control of one chamber of Congress or both than they do in the White House. So really 4 different scenarios. I think that the latter 2 are unfortunate for everybody. You don't get a whole lot done because you're going to be dealing with the same political strife, a lot of the issues that we've been dealing with for so long. So, fortunately, we've still found success and progress moving pharmacy initiatives forward, helping redefine initiatives as they are for long-term care pharmacy, really. Mm-hmm. So, ASCP has found ways to still be successful regardless of that split, but it's going to be a heck of a lot easier if one of them takes one way or the other.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier to move stuff, but I will say, to me, the latter 2, while unfortunate, are probably the most likely, which also sort of indicates why every strategy we have has to be really bipartisan in nature. Like, yeah, you have to tailor it to the administration, but when you look at the Hill, some of the key players aren't really going to change, right? Your tent poles, well, actually, that's with this Congress, there will be some of the tent poles that change, and I think we'll get into that later.
I think we're going to see more change in Congress. I don't think that we're going to see as much of a change in a bureaucracy if it is split. So that's our CMS folks, our HHS folks.
Yeah, which stay this, and largely will stay, And I think especially if you see a Harris administration, it will largely be a successor of Biden. I would say maybe to go back to that is, with Biden out of the race, I think the one thing that is interesting for us in the sector is we know that the Biden administration has taken a very sort of carrot approach to facilities, especially long-term care, a very stick approach to facilities, especially long-term care facilities and SNFs with transparency. I think the question is, if it's a Trump administration, we know that that was not a priority for them 4 years ago. The question I think that becomes for us is this a priority for a Harris administration, or was this a Biden priority? So maybe for us thinking about long-term care, what is the question mark there? Like, will there continue to be this level of scrutiny sort of from the White House on the broader long-term care industry? So that's maybe my first question with like Biden out. I think that dynamic is it. But I mean, my guess is we are expecting divided government in Congress. So, regardless of who is potentially signing the bill at the end of the day, I think we're still looking at, like, you're exactly right, nothing happening, and then everything happening hopefully on a Christmas tree at the end of the year.
Right, right. No.
And so talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of people miss the fact that all of the House of Representatives is up for re-election. So all of them are running, but only a portion of the Senate is running. And some you can prognosticate, okay, we might see switches in the Senate because this third of senators that are running, it favors the Republicans over the Democrats. And then in the Congress, you can make the same sort of prognostication looking at the different races. But what does that look like, and why can we do that?
Oh, yeah. So on Congresses, you're right. So all 435 members of the House of Representatives are up for election every 2 years. In the Senate, it's 1/3, so it's 33 senators, except for the year that it's 34. And this year's a rough map for Democrats. You've got Sherrod Brown, who's long held out in red Ohio, John Tester, Democrat in red Montana, and then you've got folks like Tammy Baldwin in swingy Wisconsin, and then you've got the vacancy being left open by Debbie Stabenow in Michigan, another swingy state, as well as we got to re-elect Warnock down in Georgia, as well as an open seat in Arizona. So Democrats and that's before you start talking about Bob Casey in Pennsylvania and Jackie Rosen in Nevada. There's just those races are rough races, and Democrats, to maintain the balance of power in the Senate, need to run the table. There's not really a pickup opportunity at all for Democrats. All they have to do is defend. And so
I think that you're completely right. And it also goes to the point of, we've seen this playbook before. It is so divided. We are used to that in the sense that those 8 states that Jim rattled off are really going to be what decides how the balance of power looks in Congress for the next 6 years at least. And of course, like we've mentioned in the House, that can change. But those 8 states is going to be so imperative. And I do think we're going to see a lot of things change. I mean, it's kind of a flipped coin. In one sense, part of pharmacy and long-term care is not the hottest topic in healthcare. So when you're thinking about what are you going to be voting on the ballot, people don't show up to the ballot to say, I am voting for pharmacist provider status.
We should be, though, shouldn't we?
Really?
I do think it would be helpful. But
we can make sure you get a list to see if your current member of Congress is supporting the bill. And if they've earned your vote again.
We can do that. And one of the things about that's great is that we can work within a little bit of a mixed political environment. It is not shockingly political one way or the other. It can be discussed and embraced by both parties. So that's positive. We've seen the way that works. But, we know what the focus of healthcare would be, basically based off of whoever gets the presidency, but the legislation that will follow, again, will be based off of the balance of power. So if Kamala Harris wins, we anticipate we're going to see a lot of abortion protection. So when you're talking about federal healthcare packages, they're still going to shove it in. They're still going to attach it to funding because Congress won't be able to have a bipartisan conversation and pass legislation the old-fashioned way. However, they still will say, everything has to be attached to protecting abortion rights, to protecting newborn children, mothers, maternity work. That's going to be a lot of the focus. Whereas the Trump administration, I think we're going to see a lot more rollbacks, some of which will impact pharmacy should the Trump administration take over again. So the IRA, we're going to see some massive changes on that front as far as, pharmaceutical price negotiation, that type of thing. You're also going to see some CARES Act stuff rolled back. So funding to states, which is going to be huge because once you get the states involved, you can really kind of change the political dynamic of who they're going to elect next. And I think that will kind of impact the pipeline a little bit more when you start to touch CARES funding because so much of that went down to the states. But the last thing I'll say there is that I do think that on the Democratic side of things, Kamala Harris would very much deepen the IRA negotiations. So we would very much see that. And those are two prevalent policy topics with very different outcomes based off of who wins the presidency.
Yeah. And I think I think you also potentially even look at, do you expand that Medicare price negotiation to other marketplaces, right?
Absolutely.
Is that, is this the Medicaid space? Is there a mechanism where employer-sponsored plans are able to opt in to some sort of negotiated pricing with HHS?
Sure.
And I would also, so I swapped out my pin today because I'm, playing the Democrat. So, for Democrats, though, I think the answer the Democrats have had for a long time is price negotiation, and they got it. And I think in a lot of ways it's the dog that cut the car. Now they don't know what to do with it. There isn't anything to do from here. So a Harris administration essentially has to double down on this as the tool because there really isn't anything else in pipeline being proposed. I would say too, I think one of the things you had said this with, if there is a Trump administration, IRA rollbacks, the second Biden got there, they put that Trump rebate roll on hold. That was their thing. And then the IRA officially got rid of it. I think that would be something you would probably expect Trump administration to do January 21st is rebate roll back into effect with a timeline of implementation.
Absolutely. I agree.
So with that said, when I look at IRA, trying to not look at it as a pharmacist point of view, it seems like it's a win for America. And even with you look at pharmacists or pharmacy in general, it's really impacting, or at least right now, long-term care more than anything else. Tell me kind of the reasoning why you think, other than just political reasonings, why any administration, Trump or whatever, would roll that back, or they're not going to negotiate price, or they're going to change that, because it seems like everybody's winning from that outside of long-term care pharmacy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good perspective. It's tough because, like we said, we kind of do exist in the middle. So there's going to be wins and losses. There's never been a regulatory package passed on a healthcare bill. I promise you, I don't know the entire American public, but I can guarantee it that nobody has ever looked at a bill and said, I love every single thing about this. There's always going to be something that they don't like. But the difference with the IRA is you're fighting one of the largest lobbying powers. You are fighting Big Pharma, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to fight the PBMs because you don't want to fight the insurers and providers, and Big Pharma hates the IRA. So, that's really going to be a big initiative there, because even if there's some provisions that they could live with, they might even like, because there are, those price negotiations, regardless of what they mean for their bottom line right now, it's always a slippery slope. So we have a trickle-down effect of policy. We're seeing this from the current Biden administration writ large. So they negotiated Medicare cost of drugs in the IRA. Then they started to try to impose like 80-20 provisions on the home health world, the home care world. Then they, capped costs in home health. So we're seeing that across lines. Yep. We're also seeing things with like the minimum staffing rule. They're trying to impose more on the private sector, and the private sector lobbies. So that's really going to be a big part of that effort, regardless of who comes into office, is what those lobbies want.
Well, I will say, though, to me, I think, and I always have this in like our Washington update, is like one of the last lines where I talk about PBM reform is it says the power of pharma, ? Right? I think pharma is, for a long time, was perceived as super powerful, but they lost the IRA. And, since sort of the start of this Congress, they've been pointing the finger at PBMs as like, these guys are the ones. And this Congress still hasn't been able to do anything. So while I think they are an extremely powerful lobby, are the insurers more powerful? And I think maybe those are, I think that's sort of what we're seeing. And so I think, regardless of who's in charge in the White House, and regardless of who, has the gavels in the House and the Senate, D or R after their name, like that is the reality we have to face, is that the people who have the most political clout, the most political power in Washington these days are not the pharmaceutical companies as we've long thought and everyone envisions. It's the insurance companies are really the ones with this huge, they're the ones with the political power, and they're the ones who play ball.
If I could, that one is really interesting. Sorry, Chad.
No, go ahead.
Is that the insurers are definitely a more powerful lobby than Big Pharma, and that is really by design. You think of the Affordable Care Act. It went into place. The government, just like we saw in Operation Warp Speed, they wanted to have somebody on the hook for their health care. So you have the insurance companies on the hook. So they're going to be much more receptive to the insurer's perspective. They want to talk to AHIP. They want to talk to those insurance plans way more than they want to talk to providers and Big Pharma. So I think they're much more powerful. However, you think about a Republican administration, they don't like the Affordable Care Act. So there is a reason that they are less likely to listen to that more powerful insurance lobby versus Big Pharma. Plus, Big Pharma has stigma behind it. Obviously, we know all of the great things that pharmaceutical companies do in the realms of innovation and just bringing more to patients and the healthcare system writ large. But they got a bad rap. And I think that the current potential Republican administration doesn't really care about bad raps, and we see that in everything they do.
I think that's for sure. I also would say, too, another testament to the power of insurance companies is we spent 12 years talking about repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act and never got rid of something that requires people to purchase a private product. Which I then think, I actually find that interesting, and I think maybe Republicans have learned their lesson with repeal and replace. I am not hearing repeal and replace the IRA. It's about drug price negotiations. It's about some of these specific provisions. And I think while at the end of the day, the legislative vehicle that would do it would likely be a wholesale repeal. You're not hearing that type of repeal and replace message.
Sure.
Well, some of it is something you always say, which is why are elections important? Because if you win, you control where the money goes.
You make
it's
the rules.
all about money.
You make the rules.
And I think that, to your point, and to Tom's point, is the IRA good for America? I mean, it's a pretty easy sell. Lower drug prices, everybody wants that. Who doesn't want that? As a taxpayer that pays, we all pay and fund Medicare and Medicaid, we want them to buy things cheaper because that ultimately, whether they use it right, is money back in our pockets, kind of. I mean, so everybody's sort of, the IRA is great. And I think the position we find ourselves in this whole PBM battle is the administration currently wants the IRA to succeed. To your point, if Kamala wins, she's going to double down and want it to succeed. Even if the Republicans, Trump wins, they're going to want it to succeed from a public perspective. I don't think they want to tear it apart.
Oh, you don't think Donald Trump wants the press conference where he goes to Solara 79% reduction?
Right.
Of course he wants that press conference.
But they'll get more.
He'd love to rip it apart too. He wants the press conference.
More ability to pick what drugs do we look
Want
at.
to put his name on it.
And how does it impact? And I also think that because of that, both administrations want to hear from pharmacy. If it's not going to work because you've destroyed the ability for pharmacies to survive, they both, I think, inherently want to fix that. There's opportunity to fix that. I don't think they want to. You're both groaning. That's concerning. I think the point is, nobody wants to see the mom and pop, rural pharmacy go out of business in favor of a big chain that has terrible service. And I'm not.
Nobody wants to.
Nobody wants that. So there's got to be, and to both of your points, they are looking at the PBMs as now you're the big dog in the fight. And you can't have these things and it not affect you.
Right.
This can't be manufacturers lose, pharmacies lose, we win, and when we even look like we're going to lose, we just change it so that we don't lose, but these people lose more. There can't continue to be that overwhelming, big dog in PBMs that keeps winning everywhere. And I think that's why you have bipartisan support for reform. To your point, we're not moving it. We need better stories. We need better talking points to move it. But
we need Ron Wyden and Richie Neal to get out of the way.
Or
to move.
Yeah.
They need to move.
And I think about that when you say, nobody wants to see an independent rural pharmacy go down.
Right.
No.
Absolutely. However, they don't really care either, because the big thing that they want is they want it to fit into that narrative. So nobody wants to see a rural business go under, because that is bad for politics. Nobody wants to see a pharmacist with a doctorate level of education not be able to provide for their families, because that doesn't fit a good narrative of a positive economy and educational opportunities and everything else that both parties want. So a pharmacist and a pharmacy is really, we've had such a great opportunity to be representative of all of those things, but it's so important that we pitch ourselves to either party, and we have done so. Yeah. Because it can go both ways, but they're not thinking about it as geez, we have to help these pharmacists. They're thinking about, yikes, I cannot look bad to rural America and to providers and to smart Americans.
And we can't... Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think the most important thing is we can't take the numbers and run the numbers of what the cost is going to be with the negotiated drugs and say, this is how much money my pharmacy is going to lose. We have to say, this is how many patients I'm not going to be able to serve because I'm going to go out of business. This is how many pink slips I'm going to have to give out to my employees. It needs to be framed in that regard of, when I go under, these are the patients that don't get served. When I go under, these are your constituents, the people who vote for you, that are not going to have a job.
Well, yeah, and we talk about this as it's not necessarily a reality, but it's a perceived reality that if the plans are so bad and the pharmacy starts saying, I'm not taking it, I'm not going to take this plan from United Healthcare, and you have to call the nursing home and say, hey, I know I service your 100 patients, but 17 of them have United and I'm not servicing them anymore. So you've got to go figure it out, and you got to talk to those families. Hey, you can't use the pharmacy that works for this nursing facility, you got to go find one on your own, or that nursing home administrator has to go find one on their own. Like now you're turning turning it into chaos, and you're making those caregivers, whether they're the nursing home caregivers or the family caregivers, say, wait a minute, why isn't my insurance covering?
You still have to KISS method it though. Like, I mean, that gets into like a very specific,
sure.
like, keep it simple. People out of work, people not getting their medicines. Like, it needs to be that simple. And I mean, that's like when you hear, and I mean, that's why NCPA and their members have been so successful when they talk about this, and their stories are.
ASCP's been successful too.
I mean, but I think with them, but it's so visible for them because they are also the retail side, right?
Sure.
Like that's what I was saying more maybe less Etsy, the retail pharmacy sector. It does a good job of telling that story because you can see the patient is you, the patient is your neighbor. For us, a lot of our challenges is that our patients, the people we care for, are a statistic in a lot of ways to these policymakers. There are X number of nursing home residents in my district. They don't think about it as, while they might think about an individual person as like, okay, that's Sue, she's got 2 grandkids, but I don't think there's a disconnect between thinking about the individual Sue and thinking about that statistic that I think somehow that like the humanity gets lost in that middle.
Yeah, it's a visibility and invisibility thing. And what did we grew in COVID as an industry because we had to explain to agencies and legislators what long-term care and what long-term care pharmacy were.
Well,
we
and
had to
because
make
that's
it
where the problem
visible.
was.
That's where the challenges were.
We had to make it visible then, because otherwise they would have been like, oh no, CVS and Walgreens could vaccinate everybody. I'm like, no, wait. There's this whole other industry, and they're vulnerable, and they have this whole other superstructure of pharmacy that works really well. We got to utilize that. And I used to think, we moved through that, and it's easier to talk about who we are because so many people heard about it during COVID, but now it's going to the next level of, well, now I have to explain to you how long-term care pharmacy works because you don't understand how it works. When you're the PBM and you pull a lever and you say, I'm going to pay my pharmacies less because I want to, they don't realize the implication it has to a long-term care pharmacy maybe differently than a community pharmacy. Not that it doesn't affect them both badly.
Yeah.
But now you're talking about disrupting something that doesn't have. You can't walk to another pharmacy in a nursing home. You've got the pharmacy.
No, yeah.
Sure.
So it's not as easy. You are impacting people, and they are going to start asking questions around. Wait a minute. I thought, pharmacy's invisible. Like mom or dad are doing fine. I never hear about pharmacy unless I get a bill. Now
Pharmacy and long-term care is invisible.
Yeah, we have to make it more visible because otherwise people don't recognize, oh, I'm not going to get that anymore because this pharmacy can't accept this plan because this plan's not reimbursing.
Well, a lot of time because the folks are doles. There is no bill that goes to.
Right.
There the pharmacy is.
Right.
So let me broaden this a little bit. Everybody knows that America's $34 trillion in debt, or whatever that running clock is, and I've heard people say that Medicare itself is actually bankrupt today. Like we're borrowing money just as today, more or less, that we're going to have another 20 million, 25 million seniors hit that Medicare. And so when I listen to Trump, when I listen to Kamala, it seems like healthcare is one of their 500 items that they're talking about, and it doesn't seem in the top 5 list for any of them, because there's so many other dynamic things that they're talking about and political things they're talking about. But the reality of it is we are in debt and we are running out of money, and we have this tsunami of seniors that's hitting us. Do you think that, or do you, from your guys' experience there on Capitol Hill, do you think that is just a silent nuclear bomb that continues to come here, and that it's going to become such an epidemic and such an issue in 4 years that it's going to be the main focus of whoever's running for office? Or do you think that there's going to be enough changes that's going to happen that's going to push that can down the road a little bit further?
The debt or Medicare itself?
Well, I guess both. Because Medicare is directly affected as one of the consumers of money.
It's a public service, absolutely. I think that It's a ticking time bomb, but we don't really have a time limit on it as far as the national
debt. It's not real money.
At this point, it's fake money. I hate that. It's painful to say.
Yeah.
You know, at one point in time, it did matter. I think that one day, you know, we have to worry that China's going to come home to collect. Do I think that's in 4 years? No. Do I think that we're setting that up for later on? Yes. Am I a nuclear war expert? No. So I won't talk too much about that piece there. I do think it is, you know, that's how Rome fell, was they owed a bunch of people a bunch of money. But like, I think that thinking through...
I think about Rome every day.
That and they moved.
Just kidding.
They say
I'm
that-
just kidding.
That and they moved their capital. That's
Yes.
also why we shouldn't move the capital from D.C.
Yeah, two...
In my
we'll talk
case study
about
of one, yes.
But, yes, so the fall of Rome has nothing to do with Medicare, but Medicare, it is bankrupt. I mean, we're bankrupt as a country. That's what the debt is. So
Yeah.
theoretically, it depends on who you're chatting with, which economist, and which terminology they're applying to this. So yes, Medicare is bankrupt. However, there's still money in the account, so have no fear. Because they're going to continuously borrow from the national debt to ensure that we are funding Medicare. I don't think that that's going to be a problem in 4 years from a debt perspective. I think that the thing that lives rent-free in my head, thanks to Chad, is that stupid Bill Murray clip where he talks about all the eligible voters. And unfortunately...
It's a Ghostbusters clip.
A Ghostbusters clip, yes. When
Lenny.
We're only thinking
You're
of
going to save
all
the lives
eligible
of
voters.
2 million eligible voters.
And one of the big things that we have been writing is that silver tsunami wave. It has been positive to say, you know, you have X amount of voters that impact this election. But unfortunately, what we know from data, I think that polling is broken. I don't even like to look at that type of data. But what we know is that thinking through an individual 65 or older, typically older, that are going to be within our SNFs or even assisted living facilities, they get their health care, which they're happy about. Mm-hmm. But as long as they get it, they're not necessarily thinking through all those different policies because they've lived through the Affordable Care Act. They've lived through the beginning of ERISA. They've lived through all of that different health care. So it's not top of mind for them. They want to know that they can pay for their groceries and the things that aren't covered by Medicare, like their pills at the pharmacy. That's why this is so heavy, is because
Partially.
a retail pharmacy does have just more visibility.
More visibility.
And there's more visibility into the payment structure, too. Obviously, it's a freaking mess if you really know how it works. But if you know that, hey, I have to pull out physical dollars from my pocket or plastic dollars each time I go to the pharmacy, but that doesn't happen at the doctor, you get to remove a couple different steps from that there, and that visibility exists differently. So older adults are more concerned about that than even they are their Medicare and their Medicaid that's kicking in to pay for their SNF stay.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like people like, if you ask somebody if they bought something, if they paid cash for it, they're much more likely to remember than if they swipe their card for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say, so on the silver tsunami, I think, and this gets to your question of the eligible voters, we know that people tend to vote more often as they get older. What happens is the silver tsunami not only ages, and I think, as you said, they're going to care about these handful of issues. They don't really care how the sausage is made.
Right.
What happens when those folks, those are the main issues they're voting on, right? I think, maybe that's the question. Like, we're sort of getting to that point. Like, they're eligible voters, yeah, okay. But you're in your 40s, like, you're, doing the high school thing with the kids, running them to all their games, boyfriend, girlfriend nonsense. Like, maybe you're going through divorce, whatever, get them off to college. Okay, now you've hit the point where you're in your 60s and you can start thinking about, well, I have nothing better to do than go to the zoning board meeting and complain about that damn trash can, right? But no, I think it does trigger people getting more involved. So I think, to me, politically, what is the most interesting thing is what happens when those people start to vote. And while these issues, I think, are top of mind, these continue to be even more important than things like
and I think
Affordable Care Act subsidies.
That's an important point that I do actually want to caveat my statement in that I was kind of leaning in a different direction of, they're not really pitching to older adults. No. That's not really their interest because they're not as outspoken. But I do think that the silver tsunami and the older adults that ASCP and that we serve is so important because polling is broken, but that's because every time they send out a poll, they're like, geez, what the heck? Like, we knew that Hillary Clinton was going to win. We know that right now Kamala Harris is ahead like 5 points. She doesn't have as many, surveys and polls done on her as we do with Donald Trump. But I think what a big thing that happens is everybody is so targeted on young voters that never show up. And older voters still believe in their heart and soul, well, I don't talk about who I vote for. That's a private topic. So I'm not going to answer that pollster regarding what that response is. And that's how the silent flips happen. And I do think that that's in part because of older voters. Unfortunately, because of their quietness, they have an ability to silently flip an election one way or the other, which is pretty powerful. But they don't have as much of an ability to get a voice on their issue, which is what Congress requires to make quick action.
Which I think is interesting too, that AARP's priority issue 1, 2, 3, and 4 is caregiving, right? They're really speaking to the younger generation on a policy topic, going upwards, which I think is an interesting.
Want this to not happen to you. We're now making aging a young person's problem.
Which and it is interesting because whether it is because they're not representative in polls, because the sort of generation preceding the boomers was small in comparison, that they never had sort of that political voice. I'm not sure exactly how all of that is going to shake out, but I think I think what happens as those boomers really age into the I now care about politics and I vote religiously.
I have no idea. I think it's really a playbook we haven't seen play out. That's one of the things that's kind of fun now. Tom asked a lot of questions about the history of it. Well, we've seen the way it plays out. We kind of know the way both parties handle it. Also, for this election specifically, we're pretty comfortable on both sides. We've already had a Donald Trump presidency. It's a little nutty, just as far as, switching decisions on a daily basis, but we've already lived through it. We kind of know what that looks like. And then we've lived through a Biden administration, and we know that Kamala Harris is not going to reinvent the wheel. It's going to be very similar. But we don't know what happens when more very left-leaning individuals age and don't potentially shift to the conservative party that we've seen in the past.
What happens when seniors are a large percentage of the Democratic constituency?
It's
in a state like Pennsylvania.
They're going to have a brat sticker on their car and everything else. Krista had to tell me what that was. But we do anticipate that they will still move politically, but we definitely know that they won't move the way that they always have in the past. And
another part of it, I don't think we have time to talk about it today, is the fact that they are geographically moving, switching the center of power to certain states from other states. But curious, so we know a Trump administration, but is a second Trump administration where re-election not a possibility? Is it more unhinged? Because I don't know if it gets more unhinged or if that's just sort of the level of sort of shake the bureaucracy can handle.
It's a good question. Whatever I say, all we're doing is pontificating anyway. I have not a clue. I don't
want to take an over-under on it?
It seems like he has dialed back some of his rhetoric and some of his policies, and it seems like he has some better handlers that can kind of watch what he's saying a little bit more. So we actually might see, less variation should Donald Trump take the presidency. But, I was also, on the news saying that, Hillary Clinton won in 2016, so I obviously can't read the tea leaves very well, so...
I went to bed being they're going to find a case of ballots in Delaware County, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Really?
Direct quote. It's Pennsylvania, it's Delaware County, what do you expect?
Yes.
Let's go back to IRA for a second, because I got into a debate with somebody about the idea that lowering drug prices, everybody's for that, but we've built these structures where people don't. It's not common for them to write a check or pay cash for a medication. They're generally, particularly when it comes to IRA and Medicare and Medicaid, you're paying a copay. You might be paying an expensive copay for a brand name, but you're not paying the cost of the drug. So is there a chance that as IRA comes to fruition, that all of these people that are oh yeah, this was great, IRA is going to be great, are well, wait a minute.
Nope.
I didn't really get much out of it, and by the way, my premium is higher. My my PBM still charging me $40 for an Eliquis prescription, even though the price went from $560 to $200. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, and by the way, you can only spend $2,000 now of donut hole money instead of $3,800 or whatever it was. So the impact on me is a little bit less out of pocket. Like, what's going to happen when all that comes to fruition? If it does make your premium price higher, people are going to be upset with that.
Absolutely. And I think, the IRA is such a better discussion in the Beltway, so within DC, Maryland, Virginia, and within pharmacists' minds and rooms that pharmacists occupy. The American public is not familiar with what the IRA is doing, so does it change the voting and the political outcome? Probably not, but one of the things that we really struggle with the IRA is let me explain this. I like the principle of making something cheaper, because what is so wrong with our healthcare system is that if we throw insurers in there and providers and everybody and it's monopoly money, then you're not actually making healthcare more affordable. So we do have to attack the price of that. Yep. However, when you're dealing with monopoly money and you're saying, well, it's ever so expensive, yada yada yada, but the real money isn't going to be impacted by it regardless because of what they're paying at the copay, it doesn't change it for patients at the pharmacy counter, and it also doesn't really change it for the PBM or even for pharma. Where we're going to see that is down the road. We can't score it, we can't fiscally monetize that. We just know that pharmaceutical companies are going to be less likely to engage in X amount of areas of pharmaceutical research because they don't want to have price caps. So you have to go back to the economic, talking points that you don't want to have set prices. That's, typically been a conservative party line, but, Kamala Harris is taking that as well. Like, you don't want government to come into private business and say, this is how much you charge, this is how much you make, because that entirely goes against capitalism. You should be able to make however much you can. So it's tough because we're not going to see the effects for so long, and it does have a lot of good theory, but we really have no way to offer the evaluation and support behind it. And, I recently started a new graduate program, and I was listening to a guest speaker who came in, works at Johnson & Johnson, and she oversees global health and just is doing some great stuff, all over the world. She's practicing medical, she's an MD, just really great stuff. And one of the things that I said is, hey, how do you deal with the negative perception of working for Big Pharma? Like, you're doing great stuff, but you're working for Big Pharma. And then she's like, well, I can't think about it because that's not my job. My job is to do great stuff, and their job as a big pharmaceutical company is to do great stuff, and we're going to continue to do great stuff. And I really liked that answer because somewhere along the line, everybody's going to get a bad stigma, and you just have to say, well, we're going to keep batting that. But what I worry about is that all that good stuff is going to be the first to go when they start to do price constraints.
Well, and then you instantly have the, what's the first thing that goes? It's the free programs. Everyone's going to balance the checkbook. And we also know, too, that, CBO may not have scored this dynamic, but we know PBMs are going to look at every opportunity they can to balance their checkbooks on the back of the pharmacies because either their shareholders directly or the shareholders of their parent company are expecting the same results, the same quarterly returns.
Well, and also pharmacists, it's still an us and them. It's not the people, it's pharmacists. So people are still thinking of, yes, pharmacists lost on that, but that's a small subset, that's really smart people. Yeah. They're not as concerned about the American people. That's who we don't want to impact, but what they're failing to miss is the pharmacist is the American people. Yeah. The same way that all these other people that work there, but you have an industry tied to you. So now it's pharmacists, pharma, insurers, all of these different entities. Once you attach yourself to one of those industries, you're no longer the American people. You're a stakeholder.
You're a stakeholder, yeah.
So.
The American people is the American people, right? I remember writing this a million times, or American families, right? What's the definition of an American family, right? It's whatever you want it to be,
and the second you start talking about pharmacy, then somebody else that's not a pharmacist, they're going to be like, well, how elitist. That's not actually talking about American families. That's talking about a subset of them. And it's so tough when you do have to promote an industry, which is what ASCP does. That's the mission, is to promote people, pharmacists, and the industry of pharmacy and long-term care pharmacy. But also, when you do that, it does take out the eligible voting message.
The 2 billion eligible voters.
Yes.
There's a lot more than 2 billion
Yeah.
eligible
Yes.
voters. Yes.
Thoughts, Tom?
I just wanted to find out, what way Jim was going to predict that the election was going to go.
Oh my God!
And,
Don't ever ask those questions.
I actually am much more comfortable making a congressional prediction. I think we will see both chambers flip. It's a hard map for Democrats in the Senate. I think Republicans don't have to win very many to flip the math. Now Chuck Schumer has pulled it out in crazier cycles. I mean, Max Baucus, Heidi Heitkamp, folks like that. Tim Johnson back in the day, for those of us that are that old. Crazier things have happened. On the House side, I mean, Republican margins are 6 right now.
Theoretically, yeah.
Theoretically 6. So Democrats just need to flip 6 seats, and that does not include a whole host of retirements. In particular, in seats some Democrats have been licking their chops for a long time. I mean, the one that comes to mind is like Denton, right outside of Dallas. Mike Burgess is retiring, and Democrats have wanted that seat forever. Right outside of Dallas suburbs. So, a seat like that is likely to flip, and of 435, you only have to flip 6.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. I think it's a good question. I already said I've been wrong before, Tom, so I'm not really good at this game. I do anticipate that the Senate will go for the R's. Mm-hmm. Again, that's those 8 states that we talked about that are so critically important. It's really important to note at this point in time that Nevada has always been the swingiest of swing states. We are battle-born. We do decide elections.
Veronica's from Nevada.
So it will be very important to figure out what happens in that state, which obviously I'm watching along with the other 7. I anticipate that we will see Republicans in the Senate. I do still think that we could see it. I'm going to call the House a toss-up. I actually think that we could see Democrats pull it out. I think that they do have a better operation. Just with the change in our speaker from a Republican Party, like they've really changed everything else. So I think that Democrats could pull it out in the House. And I will go so far as to say that I think Donald Trump will be the next president. That's my prediction today.
Wow.
On August 26th, which is still too early.
That's why we're here.
So bring me back next month, and maybe I'll make a different guess.
I was like, I'm slowly, and I did the math yesterday to make sure of it. I have Kamala now, but it also involves Nevada. I'm sorry, it involves Nebraska too. So anytime it comes down to Nebraska too,
and also Kamala Harris has only been the candidate for a couple weeks.
Yeah.
She hasn't made any mistakes yet. We haven't seen the way that polls will change.
You haven't seen a hit attack on her. What is going to be the hit message?
She hasn't done any interviews.
Yeah.
So we haven't been able to see what will happen. She's going to make a mistake. She's a human. We're allowed to make mistakes, but that's tough for a politician to make a mistake. So I don't know how that will skew the polls. But so my prediction right now that Kamala Harris has just jumped in the bandwagon is Donald Trump. But next month, Chad, ask me, and I might have a different answer.
We might do it again. Because this is crazy. It's a crazy season, a crazy election cycle.
I'm just going to run a little update underneath, like our current.
Right.
Yeah,
we'll
maybe
say
we just
this.
do it on election day. Just count it.
I want to follow up on a more, technical. We had a Republican Congress and we had a Democratic Senate. If they flip, does it mean anything to us one way? Does this move some of these bipartisan issues? Because of the change in power in the two.
It's just going to be how we position ourselves. It's going to be how we continue to position pharmacy.
Does it make it easier for anything?
You still need 60 in the Senate.
Yeah.
You still need 60 in the Senate. It always comes down to that. So.
And it depends on who are your champions, really, because I have federal legislation right now that has some really high-level senators on it, and if they have a target on their back, it's going to be less likely to move. So it's going to be so much more about individuals and whether or not they want to vote for their policy priorities, because policy priorities in the Senate are now being taken over by members. So now if you want to do a home care or a home health bill, you better get Senator Casey's input on it.
Get in line.
Because, nobody said, hey, you're the boss of home care and home health, but he kind of is. He's just been dubbed that entity. And, Senator Grassley previously had always had such a big deal on antipsychotics and long-term care facilities. We see that. So you're going to want to continue to keep your champions where they have their strong suits. And anybody outside of that, we just have to trust that the champions will be able to message it enough with their friends.
Yeah. I don't think it really changes. You still need 60. I think, looking just at like Crapo Wyden, right? What are the differences between the two of them other than the letter after their name? And I mean, like, sort of, I think, style and stuff. Most things don't move through finance until both of them have signed off on it. So I don't know what that dynamic is going to be. I think in divided government, the game always is in the Senate.
Yeah.
Because nothing moves. You can't move the appropriations bills. That process remains broken. I think, we've proven that we can use that process successfully, but we also have to get a little bit lucky, right? The bill, like the reports have to become part of the final bill. But I think on the flip side, it all comes down to the Senate. It all comes down to budget reconciliation. It all comes down to what can get you 60 votes in the Senate. And because neither party is going to have 60 members, you're still going to have to play both sides.
I said last question, but I really meant this question is my last question. So we have PBM reform, which I think is front and center, and we have the ECAPS bill that I think is front and center, both of which, they could be reintroduced next Congress, but they both could move. Something could move before the end of the year. Will they?
Oh, God. Okay.
Before the end of the year?
Before the end of the year.
Before the end of this Congress. Will ECAPS pass?
And also remember, PBM reform is there's 20 different pieces of legislation.
Yeah.
So is it any PBM bill?
Yeah, we're going to get something done.
So everything is going to get sunk into the end of the year extenders.
Christmas tree.
Yeah.
Yep.
So they're going to say, hey, we're going to try to move this. I think we're going to see more based off of Sherrod Brown, Tester, a couple of those vulnerable members that we already said. So suddenly you're going to see that the VA Veterans Omnibus Bill package passed 2 days before the election. Who knew? And John Tester did that. We're going to see a lot of that stuff right before the election. So this is kind of the silly season where Congress is gone because they're all campaigning, but they're also going to come in because they need to get a last-second win. So I could see a couple small pieces of PBM reform getting in there. I don't anticipate anything overly meaningful getting in at the end of this cycle.
I mean, I don't see anything getting to the president's desk before December.
Yeah.
On PBM reform. They might pass a few things. Maybe they pass something that's some version of a study bill and maybe something that curtails the worst abuses in Medicare, Medicaid. Maybe, what is it? Is it S127 that's just the transparency report bill or something like that? Yeah. But anyway, that. And then on ECAPS, I think the question for that is we've got to work it, and it has to be all of pharmacy. And, everyone can always go to ascp.com/advocacy, take the advocacy alert. Other people can do it. But I mean, everyone else is in line. I keep calling it the Christmas tree. Veronica's calling it its proper name, the extenders package or whatever. But, they pass it at the holidays and everybody throws their ornament on it as it gets shoved through. Everyone is trying to put their ornament on it. We have to be the loudest people if we want our ornament on the tree. And so I think that is really the question is are we capable of being that loud? And are we really, frankly, willing to sustain it? It's great that folks are listening, right? And it's great that I hope you go and take the action alert at ascp.com/advocacy. I need you then to email it to a bunch of your friends. I need you to be talking to the people about your friends and neighbors about this. I need you to be talking to your pharmacy classmates about, hey, have you guys gotten involved in this? This is the chance, right? This needs to be all hands on deck. And I think at the organizational level, it has been that. I mean, we have a weekly call that you run on Thursday morning where this is front and center topic, but it's one thing for the organizations in Washington to do it. It's another thing for people to do it in the district where members are about to ask you for your vote.
Absolutely.
They're all asking you to go and vote for them in November. So
yeah, no, I wish I could drop this microphone.
Mic drop. Tom will do that. Any last words, Tom?
Yes, last word is thank you. Thank you, guys. You are representing us. You're representing pharmacy, you're representing home care, you're representing what we care about. And I know that every couple of years you've got a new batch of congressmen and women that you've got to educate, and you feel like you're probably starting back at ground zero. But thank you for fighting the good fight, and we will support you as you support us.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time on the podcast. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you
Remember
next
to vote. Like,
Yeah,
that's
vote.
also the most important thing.
time. Vote and send letters.